front end build tooling.
I've been trying to look at that a little bit for the projects I'm on now too. I haven't pulled any triggers yet, but it's just so many layers to go through. Again, like the client, they built the thing as we were designing it and then handed us like the incomplete thing. And so then I have to go back, and we have like 3 projects that are all on different ESLint configs and like different like standards and all this stuff. And I'm trying to like go back and, make them all the same. And it's like, okay, how many ESLint presets are overriding each other here and which one's causing the real issue, and just the whole thing. It's so
I've
much.
managed to avoid having to set up ESLint and stuff like that. I usually inherit it.
I've done 3 in the last 6 months. Yeah, we're just using Airbnb TypeScript base because I don't want to have to make I don't want to have to come up with the opinions to enforce. And if they're like that works for us, then that's fine for me. Yeah, caring about that too much makes me like tired. It just makes me like not want to do it. Yeah. Is Redwood using ES Build?
It is, yeah. It's kind of, so because there's the front end and the back end, there's the website and the API side. So there's kind of like different parts of it using different things, whether like Webpack or Babel, and the API side, which was using Babel, has been replaced with ES-Build, I believe. It may still be like ES-Build, like building some Babel stuff, but like the ES-Build is the thing that's doing it now. And I think that the goal is to have it do the website too, but I don't think that's what it currently is doing. And it was originally like a flag you had to enable, but it either already is or will be kind of like the default eventually. And it's worked out for everyone who's tried it so far. It seems to be the thing to do.
Yeah. We can talk more about this later too once we're actually recording. Was it painful to do that switch
You
up?
would have to ask Peter, because Peter's like he was someone who, like us, like he saw this, he's like, could be game changing for like everyone who uses our framework if we figure this out, and was interested in it and cranked at it for, I don't even know, could have been weeks, could have been months, and then came out of the cave and said, let there be ES build, and we had it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it seems like the Redwood switch, or not Redwood, sorry, Remix is using it too, and they have some issues every now and then with it because it doesn't provide all of the niceties, I guess, that like Babel transformers do and Webpack loaders have, things like that. But
yeah, that's why I wonder how much it's just ES build now interfacing with Babel, because yeah, all this stuff is very, very strange, and how it all works together. Because I don't feel like we like took Babel out. I just think we stopped using that to like do the actual compiling, maybe. But in terms of like the ASTs and stuff like that, I'm not sure if that's also being done with ES build, and that's type of stuff like you have to ask Peter.
Right. Yeah, because Vite uses ES build on the dev side, and for production they still use rollup for bundling.
Right, yeah, and that's where like the question of, is this meant to replace Babel or is this meant to replace Webpack, is kind of like an important thing to think about, because all these things usually are bundled all together. And it's like JS build tooling, and it's usually a couple things that have been kind of combined, and what each of these new things are trying to replace is not exactly the same.
Right. Yeah, I can't imagine like you're definitely like farther into the rabbit hole, or like farther into like seeing more of this stuff every day than I am, I think.
I think it's different, like, because you've gotten deeper into a real project of actually migrating with this tool. What I do is I build simple proof of concepts with all of them, so I can compare them to each other and understand like the trends. Whereas like I haven't migrated like a production app to ES build, so I can't really speak to that specifically. I can talk about the dev experience of using it and what features it has and how the trajectory of the project has been over the years they've been at. And then that gives you hopefully useful context to then really dig into it and actually make the right decision.
Right. Yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it too. Like I'm spending more time on, I guess, spending the last 9 months almost now on essentially the same apps, the same 2 apps. Yeah, going from I haven't really done too much, honestly. Like besides some TypeScript conversion, I've gone from like Webpack 4 to Webpack 5. which coincidentally broke hot module reloading. Or it's not, at least it's not deterministic. It doesn't work deterministically now. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, we were upgrading or in the process of upgrading to Webpack 5 and Redwood. A lot of that stuff is like, I'll see like all like the commits and PRs and stuff come through. Like I don't really look at all the code because I don't have the time to do that. Really, like there's so much code being shipped to Redwood right now. It's crazy.
Hey, what's up, Shy Ryan?
Hello.
Yeah, it's like, I don't know. It's hard to keep up with sometimes. It feels like I just have my newsletters that I look at. Webpack.
No,
you want to talk about Webpack? Switch to Parcel. So I've never actually used Parcel myself, but I've heard good things. And isn't it true that Parcel 2 switched to Rust?
Yeah, so Rust via SWC. So that is the tool. It's basically a compiler. So this is meant to more so replace like a Babel than a Webpack, and it's good that it's being kind of incorporated into something like a Parcel, because SWC by itself is not really meant for like dev consumption. Like it's a compiler, so it makes more sense to kind of have it built, have it be the engine of the build tool. And this is why Vite and Snowpack are so interesting, is they are using ES Build as this engine to then build a more full feature build tool on top. So it's like a build meta framework is what they are.
So you mentioned, you said Vite and you said Snowpack, right? Did you say something like SWC?
Yeah, so SWC is comparable to ES Build, but okay. Rust instead of Go. So they're both the low-level language implementation things. And then stuff like Vite and Snowpack are like, how do we then build all this stuff on top that's going to make it do all the stuff that Webpack does, because Webpack does a million things by now.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. I think I've heard of SWC, but I've never looked at it.
Yeah, like I said, like I went through their docs a while ago. I went through the docs for all these things, and then WMR is the only other one you want to know. That's from the Preact guys, Jason Miller. And the SWC was, I don't want to say it was like unusable, but like for me with my level of knowledge, like going to docs, like, and just wanting to use it and get spun up, like I have no idea what even to do with it, It's just kind of different levels of like how much these are for like mass consumption versus developers building other tools that are going to be for mass consumption. And you look at something like Vite, and it's being used also by frameworks like SvelteKit is using Vite instead of using like ES Build. So we're seeing some frameworks choose to use ES Build and some to use more like the full featured Vite or Snowpack.
Right. Yeah. Now, have you heard of Rome? Rome.tools.
Oh yeah. I've been following Rome for like a year now, and what's funny is Tom was like, "Does anyone know anything about Rome?" He was like, "I'm gonna be talking with those guys," and he had to be investing in them. He's one like there's 2 companies that invested, and then 3 like individuals.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so that's meant to replace all of this stuff. So when you talk about like this is meant to replace both Webpack and Babel and like ESLint and any other, probably I think it might even do testing too, so it might be replacing like your Jest or whatever. I'm not 100% sure about that, but the idea to consolidate the entire JavaScript tool chain into one monolithic tool, it's like the JavaScript build tool monolith, is like what the Rome idea is.
That's what I want. Give me that.
Yeah, it sounds compelling, and it's from the creator of Babel, so it has like a similar story to like Dino, where it's like this person created something that became the standard everyone uses, and then now he's like, this thing's gross, I'm gonna build a version that's way better.
Yeah, that's what I want. I should just kick it around sometime and see what it's like.
Pedal Stack. Not sure if I'm familiar with that.
Pedal Stack was Phoenix, Ecto, Tailwind, Alpine, and
yeah.
I don't know.
Vite's gonna do you well for Vue, React, and Svelte. Anything outside of that is gonna get dicier. That's where most of the community support is coming from, those 3, and they're all building out things. So every JavaScript framework then ends up having a kind of like they can use these tools to create like templates and like workflows around them. But you'll have kind of different levels of how much stuff has been built out, how much docs have been written, depending on how big each of those communities is. So something like Alpine, which is like people love it, like it's a much, much smaller community. So you get less of that stuff, unfortunately.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah, okay, cool. So it was Phoenix, Elixir, Tailwind, Alpine, and LiveView, I think.
Yeah, I don't know any of those tools.
Got it.
But they're all things I would like to learn and sound super sweet. I did a podcast interview with Paul from Superbase, and he uses Phoenix for their like crazy setup with it's like servers to do all their thing with Superbase.
Their real-time connections are the real-time communications Elixir, right?
Yeah, so they built a library called Realtime, which is built on Phoenix, which is Elixir. And so that's like a library they maintain.
Gotcha. I'm gonna circle back to Superbase because I got some questions. Very interested in there's like a bunch of things that I just keep pinned in Chrome that I look at every now and then. And
I love Superbase.
I've been source diving on Superbase. Like they just released announced their what's it called, grid component. It's a React table component that connects to. It's basically for rendering Postgres data. I was looking at that like last week, I think. I was just going through their repos and saw it. It was pretty
That's really interesting. I had no idea they were even building something like that.
Yeah.
I follow them like pretty closely.
It seems to be more of a trend now happening with like these newer hosts. Like, so for example, Railway, if you have a Postgres plugin, they have like a pretty simple like data viewer where you can edit data and add rows just built in.
Right, but that's not a React library that you could use yourself in a project. That's like having a nice UI interface, and that to me makes sense. And it seems like table stakes at this point. Yeah,
and so Superbase now has they released its open source React library for doing that.
It's cool. Yeah, Superbase they're very, very heavily focused on open source, and Paul's even said like he wishes they were more open source, but they're not for certain things that are like based on like data legality and integrity and stuff like that.
That's cool. Well, do you want to get started?
Yeah, totally.
And just so I have it right, it's you're on the Redwood core core team rather. Mm-hmm. You got the FSJM podcast, and you're DevRel at StepSen.
Yeah, I prefer developer advocate than DevRel.
Okay.
For the term, yeah. It's true that I work in DevRel, but my kind of more official role is I'm a developer advocate who does DevRel.
Gotcha. Cool. Yeah. All right. So I hit record on my end.
Yeah, I've been recording this whole time. So.
Oh, beautiful. Cool. I'll clap. So I'll count to 3, and then we clap on 4.
All right.
Ready? 1, 2, 3. Beautiful. And I think we're good to go. So, hey, everybody. We're welcoming back to the show this week Anthony Campolo, who is already doing many things, but it seems like the things that they've been doing has increased since last time. But as far as I'm aware, you're a Redwood core team member. Mm-hmm. You've got the FSJM podcast. And since we last talked, you are now a developer advocate for StepSen.
Yeah, that's been the biggest change since we last spoke, and it was very much connected to the work I've been doing on Redwood because GraphQL company specifically for managed GraphQL API gateways, which is a lot to unpack, but we can get into that a little bit more as we go.
Managed GraphQL API gateways. Yeah. I'm sure we'll circle around to some of that stuff too, but. So basically, like we've seen you hanging around the Discord, and you're always kind of dropping links. And it seems like whenever we're talking about something that's sort of front end related or like tooling related, you know something about it.
Yeah, I try to keep my ear to the ground as much as I can, and a lot of this I can owe to being so into podcasts and having listened to a lot of tech podcasts over now many years, because eventually you start to see the trends and you can see projects develop over time. And if you see like a project that people have been talking about for like a year, like it's not really taking that long to learn at least like a one-liner explanation of it, And so it's like, people can get very like wrapped up like, oh, there's so much stuff I have to learn. It's like, just take it like little bits and just like try and at least say like, what is this thing first off? And even that, like just being able to say what a thing is usually useful for people because they hear all these terms and it's hard to wrap their mind around it. But I just enjoy being in the conversation, hearing the conversation. And so I always try and stay aware of what's happening and then do my own kind of research to figure out like what is like where I want to place my bets in terms of what I want to learn, what I want to invest in, what I want to like recommend to other people who like respect my opinion on these types of things, you know?
Yeah, that's interesting. What you want to learn, like, so you actively think about like, what should I learn? What should I invest my time in and things like that. Do you have any sort of criteria that you follow for those, or is it more of like a gut feeling?
You can make it measurable if you want to. It's for me, it's a kind of a holistic thing where there's the bare numbers, which is things like Twitter stars, GitHub stars, Twitter followers, YouTube subscribers, members of a Discord. Like there's lots of these numbers and ways of measuring a community that are actually fairly objective once you take them in aggregate. And then you also have the intangibles, which is like how well written are the docs. And then even more intangible, how nice are they when people come in to ask questions or contribute? And so you want to look at that whole thing. And once you do that, I think you actually start to see which projects are kind of a step above most in terms of having all of that, because it requires a whole team of people with various skill sets to like do that well. And once you do it, usually other people will start kind of paying attention to it. So eventually you kind of become aware of all the interesting projects that are happening within a specific niche. Now, like there's a million projects in like blockchain, like all sorts of stuff I don't know anything about. So within my own kind of realm of front-end JavaScript, like if eventually you'll kind of get a handle on who are the interesting projects and what people are working on them and like kind of what their goals are for where they're trying to take it. And then you can think about, okay, how do we integrate these things? And how do we like collaborate between these different projects?
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to just kind of take in all the time. I think like I go through cycles of it where I'm looking around and interested, in cycles where I just can't push through anymore and, you know, go back to what I was doing or focusing on. So it's definitely like a cyclical thing for me. Yeah, I guess like, do you try to meter, do you have any sort of process, I guess, for maybe like, okay, now I feel like I want to go around and find some stuff versus, or is it sort of just like something that is always kind of ongoing with your process?
Yeah, I would say I try and cover what I think is like the important stuff and the things like this, like a need to know type thing, and then cover it to the extent you need to know to like build a proof of concept with it. So when I think of like what I'm trying to learn or what I'm trying to build or what I'm trying to do, it's usually like, how do I get this to a hello world in like the simplest way possible, but also have that hello world be a good representation of what a real version of it would be. So that can kind of be condensed down to usually like one really good, well-written blog post. So I'll usually think of like the different like React meta frameworks, which is like Gatsby, Next, Redwood, Blitz, Remix, and think, okay, like how do I make like one good Hello World tutorial for each of those, and then kind of like go down the line. So that's also what I did for like ESBuild and Vite and Snowpack. And really like anyone can do this. All you have to do is go to whatever that project's docs is, go to their getting started guide, follow it, and basically copy paste it, and then add all the stuff that hung you up and that like you would have like, okay, they should give me this command, they should give me this flag, they should have explained this part, and then change it a little bit and keep changing it. And then at the end, you should have a better getting started guide than whatever they have.
Right. So you kind of distill the things that are common amongst all of them, and you start to get a hunch for, oh, this thing lives in this space. You probably need to do A, B, and C. There may be some variances in there, but they're generally the same.
Yeah, and give you like a workflow so you can compare them. So it's like, what are you going to get if you use like the default boilerplate of Vite versus Snowpack? And then how would you deploy it with like their most basic integrated deployment setup? And so you can then look at those two tutorials and like directly map one to the other. Okay, this is what took me to get from here to here, and this is how it was deployed, and this is what took me like basically the steps are usually like, how do you create the project, which can be like start from scratch or generate a boilerplate, and then how do you get all the dependencies in there, and then what are like the conventions of the thing, like how do they map pages or how does it talk to the back end or all that kind of stuff, and then how do you deploy it. So I try to cover like those chunks of each of the things. That usually gives you enough of an idea of like what it is and what it would actually be like to work with it without having it overwhelm you with like a whole real version of it, like a production app. So it's like it's a way of like distilling it down to something that should be like comprehensible enough to at least get the point. Like you're not going to become an expert in these technologies that are reading my blog posts. Like you're going to know very, very little about each of them, but you're at least going to understand what it is and can talk about it and don't feel overwhelmed by all these tools that you don't understand.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I guess like the act of writing it down too, like writing the blog post, right? Like it helps reinforce everything too. And it's also material you can go back and reference later as well.
Yeah, I mean, the most people who write this kind of tech content will tell you they do it mostly for themselves, and if it's useful for other people, that's like cool. It's like a nice bonus.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. Well, I wanted to circle back real quick to StepZen too. So, I mean, you mentioned developer advocate. I don't exactly know what really that is like by the book, you know. So I've heard terms like DevRel. I've seen people on Twitter saying they're hiring developer advocates. I guess like my really non-educated guess would be you're basically advocating for why StepZen's useful, or how they could, they have tools that benefit a certain number of people, and so you like demonstrate why that is.
Yeah, that's a really good way to describe the way I do my dev advocate job. Part of the reason why this is a complicated conversation is that there's many facets to it that can't really all be done by one person. So there's a couple of things that are being bundled into it, which is why you have the term DevRel. So I think of DevRel as the overarching thing that includes things like dev advocates, things like community managers, things like technical content creators, and the difference between these different types of roles can be kind of fluid, project to project, and how big the projects are, what stage they are in their life cycle. But usually you can kind of break it down to there's the actual building the tools, there's explaining the tools, and then there's like interfacing with people who are using the tools. So that's how I like to think about it, because then you want to make sure you understand how the tool works. So you want to kind of work on it a little bit and at least contribute to it. And then you want to be able to explain that to people. So you want to write some like docs for it. And then you actually want to talk to people using it, because that's where you're going to learn the most about the thing that you think you already know so much about. You're using it and building with it. But so you go and talk to the people, you don't really know if anything you've done matters at all. And so it's too much for one person to do. But if you don't do a little bit of all of it, you can get kind of disconnected from the larger goal. So right. Yeah, like you said, there is no books. That's why it's like, this is a super new thing. It's kind of what used to be called a technical evangelist, which was a term that like Apple invented, I think. And it's kind of shifted a little bit and has really gone to overdrive with COVID, because you had everyone go online. So everything had to be through digital content and through these community platforms. And you just had to have people who knew how to do this,
Yeah. So it's actually, to me, it sounds more like it's more about education and learning how to help steer a thing than just like sales.
That's how I think about it, and it's funny, because this is the kind of like the big elephant in the room of this conversation is the question of, is it a marketing role or not, and should you think about it as a marketing role or not? Because like you can say, like I can say I'm not a marketer, but if I was hired to be a marketer, then that's a problem,
Yeah.
So you have to be aware of what you're actually going to be expected to do and what you really need to do. For me, I don't think you're ever going to get someone to use your thing until they understand it. So for me, getting people to learn a thing it's just a prerequisite for it being used. So I don't think of it as marketing in the technical sense, but it contributes to the bottom line in that way.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like, if a person doesn't understand your thing, like, why would they choose it? If it doesn't make sense, if it's not clear, or even if like, what the benefits aren't clear, why would they pick it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And that also involves just like empathy and understanding what are people actually building with it, what they need to build with it. Because when you're building developer tooling, it's very easy to get wrapped up in your own ideas, like what developers want. And it's very wrapped up in what you want as a developer, which can lead you astray very quickly. So that's why you need to have that like feedback loop of having people actually use the thing and build real things with it. And that's what you get from like open source frameworks, is you have dozens or hundreds or thousands of people building stuff with your thing.
Yeah. I found that a lot too with like, say, if I'm using VS Code, you'll install a plugin and it's like very specialized to whoever wrote it. And maybe I don't work that way or don't like to work that way, but I could always make my own. That's cool. It's open source, but I don't want to. So I think maybe that's part of the reason why I've always felt more comfortable. I mean, the last couple of years now using JetBrains stuff because it's all just the same, like across editors.
Well, this is why everyone's just going to use VS Code one day because it's going to integrate with everything and it's going to be so simple. And it's like, I don't know, we'll see.
Yeah,
but
it's hard to
definitely work.
That. I will resist for as long as I can. No, it sounds cool. I mean, like you've been writing a ton of blog posts too. Like you were talking about your blog earlier, and I've been impressed recently with just like the amount of content that you're putting out. So yeah, I mean, like you're doing your day job with Dev Advocate stuff. We mentioned that you're core like part of the core team on Redwood too. So I haven't been following Redwood that closely lately. Like I get the forum digest emails, so I see some conversations happening and I see some of the bigger shifts happening. But what's been going on in the Redwood world in the past several months?
Yeah, we're trying to make a big push for V1, which if you've been following Redwood for a while, it probably sounds hilarious because we originally had said we wanted to get V1 out by the end of last year, and then we said we wanted to get it out by Q1 of this year. And if you look at the calendar, we're almost at the end of Q2 already. So it's partly where over the last couple of months, like so many interesting things were happening with the framework that we kept building new stuff. And so like you get the scope creep kind of thing. And so we had to kind of dial it back and be like, all right, basically TypeScript and tests is like the big thing now of how do we get full TypeScript support, which we were working on like for a year. We talked about this on the last episode and still working on that, but I think we're getting really close. And then we have like a whole end-to-end testing suite now with Cypress for testing like the tutorial and things like that. So we want to make sure that's really going to be solid for V1. And that's why it's taking a really long time. And because we're saying like, we want this to be a serious framework. We don't want to just like put it out just because we said we were going to put it out, but that's all like super interesting stuff that I'm not really super close to because I don't know anything about TypeScript and I can write tests, but I'm not a testing expert by any means. But what I've found really interesting and what I've kind of found is like an area I can fill is trying to connect the dots for like the deployment story, because Redwood.js was originally kind of proposed and has been this like universal deployment machine is a really common term that Tom talked about a lot when he was putting it out into the world. And so the idea being that you want it to be just like your like front end Jamstack kind of sites where it just syncs to a Git repo and like you do a Git push and that updates the repo and then that triggers a build that then triggers the deploy and then you have it on a link and you just got it. And so that works really well for static front ends right now. And we want to get to that point where you actually do it with also a server and a database, which is a lot harder to do. And so I kind of broke the history of Redwood's hosting down. It's like a couple of phases in this blog post I put out recently. And like the first phase was Netlify. It was like designed for Netlify really specifically. And it was doing that with Netlify functions, which is just like a wrapper on top of AWS Lambdas, which is like a way to, it's basically just a node server actually. It's kind of funny. Like most people don't really think of Lambda, but it's actually just kind of like a node server. And it was a way to make it really easy for anyone to deploy to it without having to know AWS and like how to do the credentials and how to do like all the stuff that goes around with AWS. But as soon as like we got that, people were like, okay, but how do I just use it with AWS Lambda? So people immediately want to drop down to the base layer. And so you have people do it with the serverless framework and do it so that you have like your infrastructure as code kind of thing. And that was really great. But then people were like, okay, but actually I do want a server. So then people took this thing that was designed for serverless Lambda handlers and just ran it on PM2, just ran Node and did it that way. And we also talked about this on our first episode.
Yeah.
As
I
well.
think I was even asking about that, right? Like what if I just want to put it on a server?
Yeah, and so you can do that. So that was phase 2. So phase 0 is Netlify. Phase 1 is AWS Lambda specifically. Phase 2 was PM2 server full. And then phase 3, we're like, okay, but we still haven't figured out the database yet. So there's still this question of, in all of those scenarios, you still have a database you need to spin up completely separately from your server and then connect it with an environment variable. And we wanted to have not only the infrastructure as code with a deterministic build and everything, we wanted to have that for the front end and the back end and the database. And so that's where render comes into the picture, which is like a kind of combo between like Heroku and a Netlify. It does a little bit of both of those and tries to give you a really nice integrated experience. And so that was something we were talking about, but it hadn't been done yet. But that's shipped now. It has been for like a month or two, and it's awesome. It's like the future of dev. It's like so cool. Yeah.
That I should look into that because it sounds really nice. I mean, that's kind of like where I would probably live. I think the idea of shipping to Jamstack makes sense for many things, but I don't know. I just feel comfortable with like a Postgres database and using that, like knowing Postgres is there and using it. So the idea that it's plug and play is really killer.
And that's partly, it's always just been Postgres, and that's what's allowed us to do this on so many different hosting providers, that everyone has decided let's just all use Postgres, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't, so you sent me the blog post and I haven't read it yet. I linked it in the chat and I'll put it in the show notes as well. But I mean, to me, that's like really compelling because like I've been mentioning, I've been hanging around Remix and the Remix Discord. And that's one thing that was really nice is that, it's I don't even know what version it is, like 0.17 or something. But it has, deployment plugins for a bunch of different, like Arc, like we were talking about earlier. You can put it on Heroku, you could put it on Vercel. It just, I don't know. It's nice to be able to, you have a plugin for whatever my preferred, platform as a service of choice. And so I just plug in my credentials and it works. Like that's really, really compelling.
Yeah. And it's probably just because every one of these providers has some sort of like specific TOML or YAML file. Like there'll be a netlify.toml, or there'll be a render.yaml, or there'll be something like that. And so that's like, that is the infrastructure as code. And that's what writing the blog post is really good for me, is that I kind of went back and like, okay, I was like, who is like period done this? And like, how did they do it? Just like look at their code and kind of how it evolved and the steps it took to get there. Because when I was starting to learn Redwood, like I knew a little bit of React, and like I knew a little bit of like backend, like Express and Postgres stuff, because that's what my bootcamp covered, like was all that. And so I had to learn like the GraphQL stuff and the deployment stuff, because it just worked with Netlify. Like you would follow this tutorial and you had a done complete deployed app at the end. So you didn't have to think about that part at all. But seeing the framework go through this process of trying to make it portable basically helped me learn what actually is the difference between all of these things and what is actually the difference between serverless and just running a server. Because like I saw where like the rubber met the road with all of these things. And even Thomas, who everyone should here probably knows, he's been on the show a lot and hangs on the Discord. He works for Microsoft and has been helping with the porting from Lambda to Azure. And like people always say, it's like, oh, they're just, Azure functions are just like Lambda. It's like, they are and they aren't, like it's the same idea, but the differences are subtle enough and have large enough consequences that you'd be surprised how hard it can be to actually plug and play this stuff.
Yeah, it's not something I want to try to do. I've been really lucky in that my current day job, all the DevOps stuff is not handled by me. So when we're like, hey, we need to automate CI for this, someone else just makes it happen, and I get to use it, and it's nice. That's been really nice. Like anything on anything in my side projects, I've just been using Railway recently, and it's just all there. So I've not done like any of this stuff, and it's been great.
Yeah, Railway's awesome. I think I'm the one who told you about Railway, right?
Yeah, you did, yeah.
Yeah. There's so many hosting providers like this. Like some are just kind of database heavy. Some want to own more of like the server and the database, and some want to own like the whole thing. And then some are more focused on containers or serverless. Like that's a kind of whole separate thing. Is like, we've had people figure out how to run Redwood on Docker, but it's not really documented yet. And we don't have like a Redwood opinion around how to Dockerize, even though we know we need one. People are asking for one. So that's like another kind of like side quest on this deployment story.
Sure. Yeah, that's cool though. I mean, it sounds like it's coming a long way. And I mean, back when we talked, not like it was years ago, but everything still felt so, I don't know, kind of like it had this level of maturity to it, I think, specifically Redwood, because of the level of the documentation and the presentation of the site. It looks great. It reads great. It communicates well. So yeah, even looking at it, like as we're talking about it, just kind of scrolling through again, I'm remembering things that I liked about it. And like, I think last week or maybe 2 weeks ago, I complained about form abstractions and form libraries, and I had some feedback on that. And like most notably around like how I was talking about how like Remix just uses regular old HTML forms, and then they do have a form component that can progressively enhance it. And many people were like, well, that's too simplistic. Like there's a reason why these form extractions were made in the first place.
A lot of it's like validation helpers and things like that, because you think there's a lot of really common stuff we do with forms that's not built into the platform. It's not that you can't do it. It's just that it saves you time to have helpers built in with the form libraries.
Right. And that was honestly, that was one of the nicest things to me at first about Redwood, was the form abstraction was nice to use. And it didn't feel
and
like...
that's not even really us. We basically are using React hook form and are like kind of doing a very light abstraction on top. But you can just use React hook form by itself, or you can just literally just write an HTML form, because it's just like React. So you just throw a form component. So we give you 3 kind of different levels of form abstractions. You can kind of just pick whatever you want.
Yeah. The abstractions that you did put on it though are pretty nice. It just feels really seamless. It feels like you wouldn't be able to tell necessarily that, unless you were familiar with React hook form, that this is React hook form.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. So how do you... how much work actually is being on the core team for Redwood?
It's a thing where they're looking for people who are genuinely passionate about it and like want to be involved and are going to stick around. It's not so much about like everyone puts in a certain amount of hours or anything like that, because most people aren't being paid for it. There's some people who are being funded by Tom, his Preston Warner venture thing, and I'm not privy to what types of negotiations go on with that and how much work needs to be done or not. But I know most of the people on the core team do it in their spare time for fun, because they're passionate about it. And so they contribute what they can, and there's never anything expected of you. And it's usually just like people commit to things. And if you commit to something, then it's expected of you, but you're never expected to commit to anything. So it's really nice. And, for me before, like when I was talking to you, I was still driving for Uber. Like I used to be like working full time as a delivery man while I was like going to a coding boot camp, while I was also applying for jobs and writing all these blog posts and going out and talking at things. And once I actually had a job, even though I had to spend time doing my job, also it cut out all those other things and just gives you like the mental space to, like, even after a day of work, still keep coding for an extra hour or two, because I'm enjoying all the stuff I'm doing. I'm not like killing my body. I'll spend like 8 hours driving every day. So I feel like I've been able to be more productive in like all the things I do. So it's been great.
Yeah, I'm super glad to hear that's working out that way. So we were talking, like you mentioned React Meta Framework, and I wanted to circle back to that quickly too, because I may have mentioned it on a show at some point, but I don't think we've ever like defined what like a React Meta Framework is for the audience.
Yeah, and I would say it's not going to be specific to React. When I use the term Meta Framework, I'm usually specifically talking about something that is going to be built on either React, Vue, or Svelte. And you can probably find other ones that can map to this as well. But the idea being that those are already things built with JavaScript. Like those are already either libraries or frameworks. Don't worry about whether it's a library or framework. That's a red herring to this conversation.
Sure.
If you're building on top of one of those things, then you're a meta framework. So most people know Gatsby and Next as things that are built with React on top of React. So those are canonical examples of meta frameworks. And then you have Redwood and Blitz. And then you have things with Vue, with things like Nuxt and Gridsome, and then Svelte. A lot of people probably heard about Svelte Kit. Some people may have heard of Sapper a little while ago. So all of these things are taking the JavaScript UI library, because this is the thing, React was only the V and MVC. It's just the view. So that's why you can't just use it to build your whole thing. It's not supposed to do that. So it makes sense that people would build these more full-featured frameworks on top of it, because they own a certain space and do it really well, but people still want a more full-featured framework that can do stuff fast for them, give them good conventions, because that's what we've had for 20 years doing, development. And the way you want to have those opinions is just going to differ. That's why you're always going to end up with so many different things, because you have, do you want GraphQL? Do you not want GraphQL? Do you want to have a database opinion? Once you have a database opinion, do you want to have an ORM opinion? Do you want to have an auth opinion? So there's, so there's like different levels of these meta frameworks, and you kind of have to, going back to building a simple proof of concept with each of them, that's all you really need to do to be able to compare these things, because you'll get pretty quickly like why Gatsby is different from Redwood. Like there's no Postgres database with Gatsby, but you just have to build something with it to actually understand all the pieces and how they all fit together, and which pieces you get, and which pieces are just like, go find that one yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I've done a little bit, of searching around with, like, I've tried out Blitz, I've tried out Remix, I've tried out Next. I've never actually used Gatsby. I haven't had to use it yet. I've used Redwood a little bit. I like that, like, there's a big common ground, like the actual presentation layer, the templating layer, like it's just React. So at some level, there's always, you're always familiar with something coming in, right? And I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago, I was talking about how I never really felt comfortable, like truly comfortable with say like Rails ERB templates, embedded Ruby templates, or like, EX templates with Phoenix. But when it came to like Vue and React, I've pretty much always felt pretty comfortable after kind of the initial learning curve, like pretty comfortable building UIs with them. So it's kind of like, for me with these React meta frameworks, it's like flipping the MVC stuff around, right? So when you have like Rails or Phoenix, the backend side of it, the MVC side, like the MNC side of it are like comfortable and nice for me to work with, but the V part of it was always difficult. And with the React ones, it's like flipped around. The V part's easy, and then it's just like you said, kind of making a decision about all the others. And I've seen, it seems like some libraries, or I guess not libraries really, but some of these frameworks are allowing you to kind of pick and choose. Like you said, do you want GraphQL? Do you want REST? Do you want Postgres? Do you want Mongo? Basically providing like adaptive layers, so you can actually like plug those layers into that system, which seems interesting.
You're able to do it if you're like just shipping kind of like static assets. Like that's the one that is really easy for everyone to align on. Once you get into all the database stuff, so like it's really complicated, and why something like switching between Postgres and Mongo, it's like I've been watching Prisma spend a year figure out how to do that. Like, and they're just about to get over the finish line. It functions based on, like, I actually got Prisma thing spun up with MongoDB and like did a MongoDB Atlas thing and it works. And it's like really, really cool to kind of see that happen. But the deployment providers is more so where you want to be able to actually plug and play, because everyone kind of has their own opinion of where you want to host these things. And it's a build process. So that's what's going to be different. Your code can stay the same, but it's how you get those assets to the actual providers that's kind of complicated. And that's where like Redwood is very different from like a Next, because you have two, you have a web side and API side, and they both have a package.json, which is like, there's reasons for that, but it's also really dumb and like super hard to work with. So like how the project is set up, it's going to have huge implications of how well they're going to plug and play with these different providers. So if as you're building it, you think about that stuff, you can get to the point where it's like, okay, I need to figure out what I need to do to get them all to work together. And then you start building all the complicated stuff on top. So I think that's you really want to think about like where you want this to live and where you want to deploy it and where you may potentially want to deploy it one day, because there's a lot of considerations that go into making these things actually portable.
Yeah. Yeah, the so far the remix way has been if you do need to switch or if you want to experiment with others, you generate a new project and then just copy your app folder over to it because the project generator will like scaffold the different configurations. Like if you're using Express, there'll be like a separate server file, or if you're using Vercel, there'll be like a separate Vercel chain. And it was kind of wild. Like the first time I looked at it, I was like, oh, they want me to just make a new project and copy my app folder over. I don't think that's ever been the process for me before in like, switching to a different provider or something, but I thought it was clever. It worked. It was clever, but it wouldn't have been something that I thought of myself.
Yeah, and that makes sense because with Redwood, you have a command you run that once you run the command, you are good to deploy to that thing. Like you'll say yarn redwood deploy netlify, and it creates a netlify.toml that has the build steps. And if you say Vercel instead of netlify, it then does the things it needs to do for Vercel, but it doesn't change any of the code. So you can have your app deploy on one thing, then you just change the deploy step and then deploy it again. And you don't need to change any of the actual code in the project. Right. And this is where like just the universal deployment machine is because they all use Git. It's like at the end of the day, I think as long as you're gonna attach to a GitHub repo, like that's kind of or GitLab or Bitbucket or whatever kind of adapters you want to build in, but it all kind of comes back to these repos. That's how we're developing these things. So it makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, so part of me like thinking about changing providers willy-nilly like that would freak me out. Like a few years ago, I'd be like, no way, there's no way. we're not going off of Heroku over my dead body. You know what I mean? Like once it's set up, you don't touch it kind of stuff. So it's kind of wild to be thinking about within a few commands, you could realistically, we're not like, I've never tried to do this with a complicated, like in production app myself, but seemingly like with the universal deployment machine, you just run a command and now you're taking advantage of a different service for whatever reason. Like there'd probably be a reason for the switch, and they're just not doing it for fun. But
the reason why it's simple is because the Redwood team spent the time to figure that out. So if you were doing it for your own bespoke app, it would not be simple at all.
Yeah, exactly. That's interesting to think about. It's just such a different, I don't know. It's like what's interesting to me is like observing like the chat and like we have a few people that are doing Phoenix. We have some people that are doing your regular old monolith apps, and then a lot of the times where we're talking about like this front end tooling, that's a totally different planet. So it's kind of cool to see people's reactions to some of this stuff.
Well, at least better discussions that way. Yeah. It's like when you get only JavaScript people talking, or like only like backend framework people talking, it's like it's another type of echo chamber, And so I'm all about like what are actually commonalities between the different things that we're all doing? Because ultimately we're all putting this stuff on the web. So there are things, and that's what you've really enjoyed. And what I've really enjoyed about Remix is that Remix is like, let's lean into the web as our conventions themselves. I mean, that's like super cool.
Yeah. That's one, I don't know. I think like for me there, if I have, I'm cranking on side projects and I have, like I guess limited time right outside of my work, depending on what my energy levels are. I'm not spending 40 hours a week on side projects, right? So, like you're talking about doing research and kind of like picking a tool for a deliberate reason. Like that's one reason why I picked Remix was because it's all in MDM. Like if they're using the fetch APIs, like request API, the response API, the headers and all that stuff, it's just all in NPM. It's already there. It's existing. I'm using it also in my day job if we're using fetch. So it shared a lot of commonalities with things that I'm already like crossing day to day. So I've been enjoying it so far. So like one question I wanted to ask you too is like, since you're seeing so much, like you're going around, you're looking at these different tools and you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the fastest way possible to get to Hello World and how can I document that? Aside from Redwood, what's been like one of your favorite tools that you've discovered recently, or like at least like read about recently?
Yeah, I've definitely really enjoyed getting to use SvelteKit and kind of watch the progression of that one, because that's been kind of the only one out of all these that I can kind of say like I was actually there like the day it was released, and they're like, all right, here it is, here's the code, run this command, you can use it. and I wrote a blog post the next day, and like no one else wrote a blog post for like a month, you know? So I've actually like gotten to see this from the very, very ground level. And I already really wanted to learn Svelte, and I was already going to use Sapper most likely. So it was kind of perfect where they're like, you want a Svelte meta framework. So we're actually gonna give you the newest, hippest Svelte meta framework that like anyone's building. And it was like kind of came at the right time. And it has similar ideas to Redwood, not in the full stack sense, but in the serverless sense, because it's considered a serverless first framework. And we've been talking about serverless first since Redwood started, you know. So this is something that they kind of like branded Svelte with this kind of serverless thing. And I was like, oh, cool. Like I already get this whole thing. That makes perfect sense to me. Whereas like some people are still kind of figuring out like, what does that actually mean? And like, there's lots of kind of, you know, buzzwords and stuff that makes it hard to wrap your mind around. But I was like, okay, so you're gonna deploy the site with a Lambda. Like, cool. I'm totally into that, you know? And it's also then has like all this like server side rendering and hydration stuff. And then also is using modern build tools. It was originally using Snowpack, but then switched to Vite. So I got to see a lot of these other conversations play out within the framework of SvelteKit, which helps you kind of understand these things. Like when I was first learning Redwood, learning a little bit about Blitz was really useful because they both used Prisma. And so I was able to see the commonalities between the two and then what they each had to build on top of it to do the rest of the framework. And so it's a similar thing with seeing SvelteKit and like why they pick Snowpack in the first place, then why they switch to Vite. Like just getting to see these conversations. This is what makes open source so valuable, is that the conversations are, for the most part, in the open. SvelteKit was kind of weird because they had a lot of it happen on a private repo and then eventually made that repo public. So you can now go back and see the conversations, but they weren't really public at the time. And that's kind of another question of like how public, what it actually is working in public and what's not, what should be in public and what isn't, which kind of a bigger meta question around open source.
Yeah, like looking at SvelteKit, it kind of looks familiar already. Like you were saying, all of these things are kind of driving parallel to each other. They're just going to space out a little bit, I guess, is maybe the best analogy I can think of. Yeah, so that, I mean, it's cool. Like I have never written a line of Svelte in my life, but it looks familiar, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, Svelte's fun. Svelte is kind of meant to give you the same kind of powers you would get from React and Vue, but give you an even more concise and simple syntax, and then also building it in a way where you ship a super tiny bundle that doesn't have dependencies at all. So it's like both a win from like a DX perspective and from like a code you actually ship kind of perspective. And then the things you gotta watch out for is it's newer and doesn't have as much community support as the other two. But it's one that if you're doing React or Vue, like you really should at least do like a Svelte Hello World, because it's like going to eventually, if Svelte doesn't eventually replace one of these, something like it is going to. It's just kind of a matter of time at this point because the benefits are just so obvious. And this is why when this whole build tool thing started happening and people started talking about Vite and Snowpack and stuff like that and using it for React, I was like, yeah, like the Svelte people have been talking about this forever, you know? So you'll see these things will pop up at different places in different communities. And if you pay attention to all of them, you will inevitably be ahead of the curve in other ones.
Yeah. It's like same thing in MVC frameworks too, right? Like similar ideas, similar innovations, right? So like seeing live view happen, then Livewire happen, then Hotwire happen, you know, kind of all in a row like that. Similar.
You go back to like Django versus Rails, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With this one's with like I forget now. It's like live view is Phoenix, Livewire is Laravel, Hotwire is Rails.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure that Django has one too. I don't know.
Yeah, those are interesting. Those are things I want to learn more about because I don't know any of those frameworks or even really those languages, but I know that those things are part of the same conversation with Redwood, but it's a different kind of angle to it. And it's all wrapped up in this thing of like, how do we make full stack applications? How much do you go into a single page application versus keep it on the server? And that's like knowing all the JavaScript stuff still is only giving you part of the narrative until you see this whole other part with all these other backend things.
Yeah. I like that. That's what your perspective is. Like the whole, like you said, or like beginning of the show, like the holistic picture of something. I think that's a really healthy way to look at stuff, or it's a good way to keep yourself grounded, right? That's
Yeah, I actually think this is one thing I think I picked up from music. Funny enough, I don't usually go into the things I learned from music in coding type trips. I think most of it's crap, but this was a thing that I learned of how to look at a scene and assess what's important, and then how to be aware of the sum total of scenes that exist. And for music, it's genres. You know, you have your metalheads who only listen to metal, and you have your country fans who only listen to country. And you're not going to meet a lot of people who are metal and country fans, but there's no inherent reason why you can't listen to both and appreciate both and find masterpieces created in both. So I always like kind of made a point to try and find whatever the good stuff was for every genre, and not assume a priori that this isn't my kind of genre, you know? And it's the same thing with all these tools. Like people they always come up with these things with certain perceptions. So people are just like, they're never gonna like be happy writing JavaScript because they've decided they don't like JavaScript, you know, and same TypeScript, you know. And if you have that sort of attitude, you're gonna miss stuff because you're gonna say, I don't need to learn this thing, so you're never gonna understand it. You don't have to like go all in on it to at least learn enough of it to understand it. But that requires having like a loose filter. Like if you have a really tight filter in terms of where you're going to look at and what you're going to consider. So it's kind of like trusting the process that the larger community, when they're all talking about something, there's like some reason for that, you know?
yeah.
And at least understanding what that reason is will like be useful for you and possibly a growth opportunity.
Yeah, well, I guess to go back to the music analogy, I think as a musician, exposing yourself to multiple genres or ways of writing music is putting more tools in your toolbox. So if you're composing, you have more tools to choose from. You can essentially maybe not be more creative, but you have more at your disposal to be able to express yourself with.
Yeah, and I would say it does make you more creative, because having a wider palette of things you can do allows for a wider space of creativity. And that is, you nailed in what I didn't say, is like the reason why I actually wanted to listen to all these different kinds of music, is because then I was aware of all the different things you can do in all these different things. So I could learn how to improvise like a jazz solo and take that to like a rock band. Like the rock player is like, whoa, I've never seen anything like that, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, but at the same time, you learn like a really cool beat from like hip hop and like take that to a jazz, and the jazz be like, I've never heard something like that, you know? So you can't assume ahead of the time that all the interesting things are monopolized by one of these groups, you know?
Yeah. And even, I guess, like building on top of that a little bit too, it's been interesting to me recently. I've been going back and listening to bands that like some people would call seminal in different genres. So for example, I was like, I've never really like listened to grunge music, but it seems like there's a lot of people that like grunge music. And the first band you think of when you hear grunge is Nirvana, right? But then you start going back and listening to Nirvana's peers or like the people that influence them, and you hear some of those bands, and then you go back and listen to the other bands you listen to, you're like, oh, okay, these just sound like this band that was 10 years old.
Mudhoney was kind of the source of a lot of that grunge stuff.
Yeah, Mudhoney, and what's the other? I keep forgetting. The guy, a lot of them overdosed, right? But one of the first ones to overdose.
Talking about the guy from Alice in Chains?
Nah, not before Alice in Chains. The guitar player from this band went and started Pearl Jam.
Oh, so it was the guy from Pearl Jam.
Andrew Wood, I think, is the guy that overdosed. I forget what his band is called, but anyway, like, yeah, it's just you start to go back and listening, and you're like, oh, this is familiar because I've heard this other stuff. The same
Mother
thing
Love
with
Bone.
Mother
Yeah,
Love
I'm not
Bone
super
is the
familiar with this one.
Yeah. But that song, I'm not a huge grunge person, but that song or the band Temple of the Dog, one of their songs, Hunger Strike, I think, was written for Andrew.
That's cool. Yeah, I was actually the same way. I was never super into grunge, but I ended up appreciating Nirvana's later stuff, like In Utero and the acoustic album they did. Those are really good. And I ended up liking Alice in Chains a lot. I felt like out of all the like Pearl Jam's, like they're good, but they're not really. I'm not that big into them. And then you had like Soundgarden, which had their own kind of flavor, which was good, but I wasn't like super into. But I always felt like Alice in Chains hit like the right kind of combo of like grungy, but also like really melodic too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Lane Staley was one of the people I was going to reference to. You listen to him, and then you go and listen to more bands in the '90s, and you're like, oh, it's Lane Staley, or
Hmm.
people that are sounding like Lane Staley. But I mean, same thing with tech too. Like that was one thing that really intrigued me when we had Eric on the show. He wrote Grokking Simplicity, right? Was he, was talking about going back and reading papers and reading white papers and reading research stuff, and then kind of like trying to relate it to what he has been learning recently, or
Well,
learn more recently.
what's hilarious is when you had him on, like I saw you advertise that beforehand, and I didn't realize until he started talking that I'd already been listening to his podcast for like 2 years. He has his own podcast that's
Yeah.
super, super obscure. And he did like a 2 hour long episode about the entire history of small talk. And it was amazing. And I'm like, you're not going to hear that anywhere else on like any other podcast. And so like he has a historical perspective that like I very, very rarely see from programmers. So I was like super, super stoked to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. It was really cool. I'd love to have him on again at some point. Um, we've kept in touch a little bit, but yeah, it'd be cool to have him on just to like let him just give him the mic and let him go and see what happens.
Yeah, and that's the thing. He has a solo podcast, so it's like him just talking. Like that's
Yeah.
it takes guts to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, cool, man. I know we're rolling up on an hour. So yeah, I just wanted to ask like if there's anything else that was on your mind that you wanted to talk about more specifically.
I would say the last thing is just I'm trying to unify kind of all my worlds with like some StepZen example projects that actually use Redwood. And this has been really interesting because StepZen, as I said at the beginning, is a way to spin up a GraphQL API gateway really easily because it's managed. And so it's a way to connect to a wider range of backends than you would traditionally be able to do with a Redwood app. Because if you think about it, like we've talked about Postgres a lot,
Mm-hmm.
you have Postgres, you have Prisma, you have this whole backend already built out with Redwood, and it's very self-contained. But with like the Jamstack, a lot of the Jamstack is how do we use things like Shopify and Airtable and all these like headless e-commerce things and headless CMSs. And there's not really been a super good story for that with Redwood, aside from just like bring in node fetch and like make a fetch request, kind of thing. Whereas this is a tool that already has a lot of built-in integrations for you and has opinions about how to do like key management and stuff of like how to actually secure some of your other like backend systems. So I have a Redwood example app with Shopify. And so the Shopify thing is connected to the StepZen API. And then the StepZen API is queried from Redwood's backend, the Redwood API folder, because it has to make a request with your StepZen keys. So you can't do it from the front end because then you can like just go look at your source maps and like see your keys. So Redwood turned out to be like perfectly architected for these types of things because they already figured out how to make a GraphQL request and mask your keys and have it be deployed on like a Lambda handler for you. Because that's what most people use serverless functions for, is that exactly, And someone asked, can I put StepZen in front of a backend? That's all gRPC. If you ask hard enough, they'll figure out how to do it. Like it's a bunch of old school API people from like Google and Apogee. So I have no doubt that they speak gRPC in their sleep, but I don't think right now that is like a thing that we have like a particularly good story for. But it's certainly something that StepZen is capable of if there was like enough of a demand for it.
Yeah. So the idea of the gateway is, or at least I guess having sort of your self-contained app. I think like when you look at that, like, okay, Redwood has Prisma, Redwood has these tools here. I feel like I have to build everything inside of this umbrella of Redwood, which isn't the case. Like you can have your own local services and then make calls out to any other service just like you would in Rails, or you could in Rails or Phoenix or whatever. So yeah, so what I've been doing is I've been using Firebase for auth and then Prisma for my DB stuff. But then just like any other monolith, you could hook up to Mailgun or MailChimp or any other services. So you're basically just using StepZen as a universal translator of sorts, right? So StepZen's the thing that talks to all the other services, and then Redwood talks to the single service of StepZen.
And so not only does StepZen talk to all those things, it then consolidates all those things into a single GraphQL schema that you're able to query against.
Okay.
So that's one of the big things here is that then because your Redwood app or any app that you have set for GraphQL, like you just have a single GraphQL endpoint, you send requests to it. And GraphQL itself has the read, write, update, delete things, all that's built into the query language itself. So it's about saying, okay, we already know what we like about GraphQL. Let's like lean into that and like really like, how do we make this all work as much as a single graph that we can just send queries to? And then you may have to send that query through multiple layers to get the thing you want. But as long as they all have the same schema, they have the same types, then it works.
Right. I mean, I can imagine that'd be really empowering to, I mean, not only just like a front end team that would be using it, right? But because you'd have more people like say working on a Redwood app than just front end people. But I can imagine just having the number one, a single graph, but number two, because it's GraphQL, you have the documentation, you have the types, you have everything kind of there. And the tooling is really nice these days too. So I can imagine how that would actually, probably speed up development quite a bit.
Yeah, and it takes a little bit of time with like most of these things. It's like the cognitive burden of having to learn GraphQL and actually know what you need to know, what you don't need to know. And this is why I consider myself like very fortunate that I had been doing all this Redwood stuff, because Redwood that people talk about as like a React thing, but it's much more of a GraphQL thing than a React thing, which is pretty sure we talked about that in the last episode also. And so I was already like, I already knew what a GraphQL request was, and I already knew what a GraphQL schema was. And I had like a mental model for it that was like, okay, so now what are like the steps and isms? Because you have directives, right? And so we learned a lot about directives, which I think people don't talk about very much with GraphQL, because there's the at symbol, and there's like 4 built-in directives that people very rarely use. And it's let's see, I have a blog post for it up right here. Not that I wrote, but one of our colleagues did. So at skip, at include, at deprecated, and at specified by. And what those exactly do is not super important for this. But the idea being that it's a way to extend functionality of your GraphQL server. So there's built-in directives, those 4 I just named, but you can create your own. And so that's really what StepZen does, is they've written their own directives to connect to either a database, a REST endpoint, or any GraphQL endpoint at all. So that's where a lot of the magic is happening. But because you're still writing the same queries, you're still writing the same schema, you're still working with it the same way, all you have to do is figure out those couple little steps and isms, and the rest is familiar.
So, I mean, now I'm just curious, is skip like allowing you to make sure something doesn't get included in like the external facing schema?
Let's see. So it says skip may be provided for fields, fragment spreads, and inline fragments, and allows for conditional exclusion during execution as defined by the if argument.
Ah, okay. Okay, cool. And include, what does that say?
Let's see. So the include allows for conditional inclusion during execution as described by the if statement. So it's the opposite. Yeah. And then deprecate, this one actually, I can deprecate is easy. You just basically say something's deprecated and then give a string giving the reason of like what it is, or just like a message to the user. So that was actually kind of a smart thing to build in. And then specified by is you can say like point to a URL with a specification for a scalar type, like what's your date type, what's that kind of stuff.
So just link someone to additional documentation.
It links to the example, links to an RFC, one of the Internet Engineering Task Force.
The heavy ones. The
one that starts with a list of defining what the word must means.
Yeah, it's given me the itch to. I've been doing a lot of front end stuff at MetaLab, and it's been a good learning experience. But I'm definitely got the itch to do some API, some back end work. I think like overall, I think I enjoy the back end side of things a little bit more. I enjoy working in that from the day to day. Honestly, largely a lot of that's due to tooling. But yeah, I've kind of gotten the itch now to do something on that side of the defense.
Cool. And then one more thing I want to mention, then we can finish off here, is that there's a really, really interesting happening with Redwood's backend, where we are potentially going to make it possible to swap out Apollo server. And we already did this with Apollo client, making it swappable with a React query provider. And so it's going to be swappable with this thing called GraphQL Helix and a thing called Envelope, which is a kind of next gen GraphQL server that's meant to like address specifically the problems with Apollo server. So it makes sense why they're like, we need to get these guys to use it. And it's from the Guild, which is like a group that's kind of a bunch of people who work together like a decentralized way, but it's mostly spearheaded by Yuri Goldstein, who is one of the founders of Apollo. So like he's been doing GraphQL since it was invented. And the thing is, going back to the problems with Azure, so Thomas will know this very well. When you try and deploy Redwood to Azure, the thing that breaks is Apollo Server Lambda. There's a specific package for deploying Apollo Server to Lambda itself. And so to like take that out and replace it with like Apollo Server Azure, like it's not quite the same things, because these weren't thought of as something that was going to be portable from the beginning. Going back to, you have to think about these different deploy targets from the start. So GraphQL Helix is meant to be more kind of plug and play and can be more easily deployed to different deploy targets. So I have no idea how it works. It's like so new and there's like not a lot of docs and stuff, but I've like, there's been a PR that's been going if anyone wants to check it out. And it's could potentially be like a game changer for the framework in a way that is like very, very hard to understand unless you're like very, very deep into this tech. So it's like, as someone very, very deep into this tech, I'm like, this is definitely interesting. No one knows why yet, but this is very, very interesting.
It took me that long just to find the Envelope repo.
Yeah, Envelope wasn't even announced until like a month ago.
Yeah. That's cool. There's a lot to dig into there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A lot to dig into
for next time.
Yeah, we'll have to have you on again for sure to talk about more of like some of the more technical specifics of this stuff, because it's definitely interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for having me. I really have enjoyed getting to like continue to hang out in the Discord and come to show tapings and whatnot. So awesome community you got, and I very much enjoy being a part of it.
Oh, we're glad you're around. Like I said, you're always just dropping links in. I'm like, I've never seen that before, you know? So like part of my learning and staying up to date is just like looking at whatever you're tweeting about or who you're replying to. I basically just scroll on Twitter. I never tweet. And so I follow you, and I get a lot of information from just you talking to people. So yeah, I guess I'll have to say, like, you know, we're glad you're around, and you're glad to, you know, you're sharing your information freely. So
cool. Yeah, no, happy to.
Cool. Well, yeah, I'll circle back up with you, and we'll have to get you on again. But until then, keep up the good fight, I guess. You got the energy. Let's. I'm gonna ride your coattails.
Yeah, I'm still enjoying it. We'll see when I burn out.
Cool. All right, man. We'll talk to you soon. All right, recording done. Now the real show can begin.
Now we get to talk trash.
Yeah. No, this is all really interesting stuff. I can't click on the link. Because of StreamYard. Yeah, like Shy Ryan saying, don't burn out. Because you're filling up my tanks.
Yeah, I mean, I just find this stuff really interesting, and like I say, like this is also me. Like I've been following this stuff for so long. So once you kind of have a handle on all of it, it becomes easier. And like you say, like knowing who to follow. Like once you know who to follow, you can actually see these developments as they're happening, and then like you'll see like how long it takes for something to actually happen on Twitter, and then for people to start talking about it. You know.
Yeah, I guess one question I had too was, do you think you'll ever want to get into like product work or consulting, or are you pretty happy doing like the advocate and kind of open source stuff?
I can see myself doing all sorts of things. I'm actually going to be writing a book really soon. I'm about to sign a Redwood book deal, so that's going to be pretty cool.
Really?
But yeah. But I am kind of interested in, once I have some capital, doing like angel investing. Like it would be super cool, like invest in Supabase. Like I know people who did invest in Supabase because they saw it from the beginning, like this is gonna be a rocket ship, and like they wanted to get in on. So I'm close enough now to a lot of these developer companies that I can actually see what are good investments. So that's probably what I kind of want to get into. But I don't know. I'm open to do all sorts of stuff. So we'll see kind of I feel like I'll eventually want to go like independent one day, but like I'm happy at my current job and I get compensated very, very well and have a cool team of people. So I'm happy where I am right now. And just kind of just a question of like, how good of an other opportunity would it take to pull me away from that? And right now, it'd take a lot, you know?
Yeah, similar position with me. Like I'm pretty happy doing what I'm doing, and they're taking care of me pretty well. And it would I don't have like a number in my head, but it'd have to be a pretty considerable change to pull me away. That or maybe,
like which framework is the worst framework?
Yeah. He wants to get into.
Yeah, that goes back to me trying to find the good in all these things. I have a hard time picking a worst framework. I think that it's kind of had its time was Gatsby, and I think Gatsby kind of like is on its way out in the sense that it's like has a lot of legacy to it now, but it's not. It hasn't really evolved with the times well enough to keep up, and so is kind of like now being hacked to try and do all these other things I wasn't really meant to do. It has this whole like plugin system that's kind of a mess now, and it blazed the trail for like so many things. That's why I was like, I don't want to like talk crap about Gatsby, but at the same time, like I wouldn't really recommend most people build with it today. If they want just a static site generator, they should use 11D, and if they want like some sort of crazy GraphQL thing, there's like a million options for that now. So that's one that I think if people who are kind of like reading stuff that's like a couple years out of date, then may like go more towards that and not really realize that there's probably better options now.
Yeah, I really have not used it. I've heard a lot of good stuff about 11D recently, though.
Yeah, 11D's killer because it's kind of like, let's just like write Jekyll in Node. Like it's just a standard static site generator, you know, and it doesn't try to be anything more than that. But because it's a Node, everyone knows how to write Node. It has like a very, very strong community. It has lots of like different templating languages you can use with it. And because going back to like all these Lambda serverless things are all Node servers, what people are starting to do now is use Lambdas to generate the HTML and then throw that over the wire. And so like 11D is already set up for that. So that was kind of like the stars aligning type thing. And
so that's
also has a very strong accessibility focus as well, which is nice.
So that's kind of like your incremental static generation portion of that, where you hit the Lambda and you get actual HTML back.
Yeah, yes. So that's the exact idea. And this is why now Netlify has their own version of this distributed persistent rendering, which is like another new buzzword.
I was wondering about that too, because like it's really interesting watching the remix talk, because they're all like fundamental. You don't need it. The browser has a cache built in, HTTP cache, you know. And then I like go on Twitter. I'm like, what's this thing that Netlify just invented, you know? And then like watching the correspondence between them, it's been really interesting.
Yeah, and this is also downstream of like just the conversation of like SSG versus SSR and pre-rendering, and like Redwood went through this whole debate because we implemented our own pre-rendering implementation as well, and like we did a whole FSJM episode about it, and like I was so confused about it for so long, and it's part of the problem is just that like everyone chose to invent a new term for the same thing because they all did it a little bit differently. So like I don't want to call this other thing, so people are gonna think it's gonna do this and it actually does this, and so they are different enough to like you shouldn't call them all the same thing, but they're all meant to kind of like figure out where do you actually want to build the HTML, like where do you want to build things, mostly on the server, mostly on the client. Do you want to try and split the difference at the most optimal times? And just like that's just not a simple problem, you know. There's never going to be one kind of solution for that. But then the real problem is then different frameworks started like battling over which could do what, and you would end up like you'd have Gatsby write like a whole doc about server-side rendering, and that whole doc should be one sentence saying we don't do server-side rendering, but they write this long convoluted thing trying to like make people think they do, you know.
Yeah It's a lot of it is like positioning, marketing kind of writing. Like you say, you could just say we don't do SSR, but they don't want to lose people that would be turned off by that. So and
people who are coming to it, and the first question they ask is, does this thing do SSR? You know?
Yeah. Yeah, that's I don't know. I observe those conversations, but I don't have any stake in them, so I haven't necessarily formed any hard opinions. Like the remix. One of the videos I watched or the streams I watched, they were talking about like static site generation, where it's like before there's incremental generation, you would make a change and it would re-chunk the entire site, which seems wasteful, and then you would make a change and it would have to do a bunch of logic to figure out what changed, and then it might re-chunk that one piece. And then there's like incremental changes or incremental generation where you don't actually statically generate the thing until the first request, and then it generates it. And then they're like, that's just
the
cache.
build time versus runtime thing is where a lot of the complicated stuff starts to come in.
Yeah. I get it. Like I could see how it could be useful, or I could see the natural evolution of it happening from, the base static build, but I just don't really have any skin in the game, so to speak. So yeah, I don't know. For me, it's like you can make things fast many different ways. So I'm not too worried about which one wins.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is like as long as your framework has thought about it as a developer, you really shouldn't. And that's why we use these opinionated frameworks in the first place, is so other people solve these higher level problems for us, like accessibility. Like we kind of built in like a route announcement thing, so when you like navigate to different pages, like the screen reader doesn't get confused because you're not sending a request to the server, you're like executing JavaScript, right? So single page applications really trip up screen readers if you don't kind of build them very, very carefully.
Right. Yeah, I haven't actually. I wonder. I mean, I would assume that React Router is accessible. They have a whole like other library that like focuses, or like UI kit that focuses on accessibility. I think it's called Reach. I've never
Reach
actually looked into this.
Reach Router.
Yeah, I've never actually looked into that stuff myself.
Yeah, I would say if you want to know about that, you should talk to Dom. He's the guy who implemented the accessibility stuff on Redwood. He has strong opinions about that, and it's out of my element, so I don't want to also make those same strong opinions. But
Right.
It's and the problem is saying it's an accessible router or not is already like the wrong way to frame it, because this whole accessibility conversation is so many shades of gray of like what is accessible and not, and what is required, what is legal, what is moral, what is economic, and all that stuff, and how it all spins out. So it's about like, is your framework at least making an effort to think about accessibility and make their framework better in whatever ways that requires? Like that's kind of what I look for mostly, and some do and some don't,
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's there's just so much to anything. There's so much stuff to do, accessibility wise, performance wise, maintainability wise. It's just so much.
Yeah, it's quite the mental exercise. Keep it all in your head.
Yeah, it really is. Like I've been trying, like I don't know. You see people kind of drag themselves for not being able to, like, especially programmers that are earlier in their career, like feeling bad for having to look stuff up, and that kind of bums me out because I'm like, I do it all the time,
Well,
so
yeah,
I always try to be really.
You always learn at some point that your job eventually becomes only looking things up once you hit a certain level.
Right. Yeah. And so one thing I've been trying to do lately is with the devs I'm working with right now is if I just rattle something off the top of my head, I try to say like why I know that or how I learned it. So like if we're talking and I'll be like, oh, actually, here's your answer. I know this because I read about it yesterday morning. And that's actually
I like dropping links. As long as you got the link, and it's like put up or shut up. Like here's the link.
Yeah, it's funny because at least a couple of times in the last 2 weeks, the thing that I was referencing, I was like, I only learned this like 2 days ago. So this isn't something that I just know because I'm a senior dev. I just read it. I happened to be reading it yesterday, so that's why it's fresh in my mind. Trying to like constantly reinforce that. It's looking like you get good at knowing how to find things. Knowing how to exclude things, knowing how to, work your way through the jungle of listicles to find what you actually need to get to.
Yeah, totally. That's why I much more enjoy like just podcasts, and kind of like it's a slower game in terms of trying to follow like the sum total of the conversation, because you're never able to find one podcast to give you all the answers. It's like only after you listen to like a sum total, like 1,000 of them, you're like all of a sudden like just all clicks. You're like, okay, I get it all now,
Yeah, one thing I've been trying to do more of, or one thing I've been wanting to find more of is like advanced. I don't know, people that are like really good at what they're doing, just doing that thing. So whether that's on Twitch, like someone programming, uh, like someone senior that's programming, or YouTube videos, like they can be hard to find good ones. But yeah, I just like to. I guess like most of my career, I've worked on very small teams, and I haven't worked with that many different people yet. And so that's one thing I'm interested in, is just like observing other people that are good at it, and I'm trying to pick stuff up from that.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite things about Twitch is that on Twitch you can like just watch people work and then also hang out with them and ask them questions and stuff. You should definitely check out B Dougie, Brian Douglas. He's a developer advocate at or staff developer advocate at GitHub right now, and he was the third employee at Netlify. So he was actually one of like the people who first actually went out and like told people like what the Jamstack was, because Netlify invented the term, and he hosts Jamstack Radio. And so I met him through that whole Jamstack thing, and he was the second podcast I was on, which was like 3 or 4 months before we did the first episode here. And he was like, "Oh, you should check out my project Open Sourced." And it's a thing he's building as a tool to help other people get into open source. And it's like very much like a passion project, like not like it's not very sophisticated, but it's a thing to like kind of build together that also like is open source. It's meant to help people get into open source. And he also then streams himself building it. And it's been really fun because he was using originally, he has like this whole setup with like GraphQL, like OneGraph, and now he's kind of like messing around with like Redwoot and Supabase because like he heard me talking about it constantly. I was like, I gotta try these things. And so now he's like building with those also on the stream. So it's really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, I just followed. Yeah, I would like to do.
And then Learn with Jason's like the other one you'll definitely want to watch.
Yeah, we've actually had Jason on the show last year at some point.
Oh, really? Yeah, that dude is like podcast, master. He's been on almost every single tech podcast there is at this point.
Yeah, I would love to just watch Sarah Drasner work. Everything she does is like
she did Learn with Jason episodes, so that's
Yeah, that's cool. I've been wanting to do a little bit more of that. Maybe I can now that I'm less like a tumbleweed these days.
You should. I'd totally watch that.
Yeah. I think I was kind of getting bummed out of like, all right, I'm doing some Phoenix stuff. Okay, now I have to learn Laravel actually, so I have to spend my, my free time. Well, not free time, but like my side project time learning Laravel, and then I'm just like not knowing how to do anything, and that was a little frustrating to stream. But now that I'm less, I'm more into just like I'm just doing Node basically, so I think it'd be a little bit easier for me to feel productive and do that at the same time.
And then your viewers would know what you're actually doing. Right.
Yeah, like Thomas wants to get back into it too. I like hanging with Thomas while he programs too.
Yeah, I've learned a ton from Thomas already.
Yeah. So, yeah, maybe I'll try to do that more. Hopefully, we'll see.
It's hard. That's like having done almost every form of content creation now. It's like streaming definitely takes like the most setup. You need a camera and a mic. And also you need to be able to screen share. And if you're actually going to do coding, then you have to actually like you have a dev environment set up, and you have to like, if you don't know what you're going to build, at least know you're going to build something you hopefully know how to build, So there's a lot of stuff to it.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to do now is also Shira, and I see that, and now I'm going to go watch your old streams. All right. You can't stop me. So now, like I'm trying to get past this just starting out phase of these projects that I'm sort of perpetually stuck in. It's my fault, okay? But I'm trying to get past it, like just starting out phase, to where it's like, okay, this is a thing, I'm building it. I'm building it for a while, so I have like defined features that I want to build out. So that's a lot easier.
That's the perfect reason to stream. It'll force you to sit down for a certain amount of time and work on that thing and be publicly accountable for doing it.
Exactly. So yeah, that's maybe what my goal would be, is to get to that point. And I'm getting closer in a couple of just side projects for fun. And I'm trying to keep that post that Greg wrote a while back in mind too. Like, you can just make a side project for fun and not try to make a business out of it, which is my default stance to like think of like, how can I monetize this? I need to stop doing that. I just want to, have fun.
So the guy who sold a project to Kong.
Right. Yeah. says, yeah, exactly. What's actually funny, I don't know if you noticed this, but you told me about Railway. We talked about it a few times. I told Greg about it. Now Greg works
Then
for
you got a
Railway.
job, yeah. Yeah, no, you said that on when it happened on an episode. Like that blew my mind. Actually, like, that really kind of was like, wow, okay. It's like it for me. That's at least validation that all this time I spent trying to follow these trends and like figure out what is actually important and not, like, actually seems to have paid off, and that I was not like going down this like weird rabbit hole. It actually did find, like, the things I thought were important actually are important to at least other people, like, who are also doing important. Like, I got built insomnia, dude. Like, that's awesome.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's you are a trendsetter.
I'm a thought fluencer.
Thought fluencer. Yeah, Shiner, and I just see like the clips that you have on there, like a couple of minutes, but I'll still watch those.
Yeah, that's a big problem with Twitch. People don't realize Twitch videos only last for like 2 weeks.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, so we like with DNC, like we could do the it's not partner. That's the big one. It's the affiliate. We could do that, but I don't feel super compelled to have subs or anything like that. So, yeah, and then having things go to YouTube is also nice. So.
Yeah, that's especially with something like StreamYard, you can have that set up to where you stream it to Twitch, but then have it just also stream to YouTube, so it's there on YouTube at the end,
Yeah, it's kind of nice to have that. I should probably go through and do editing work or something, clean it up or whatever, maybe cut segments out, but who's got time to do that?
Oh my god, yeah. It's been the big thing. The thing that took the most hit for me was my podcast. I went from doing 2 episodes a week to like 1 every 2 weeks.
Dude, yeah, it's a lot of work. Shout out to Rockwell for. I think he took tonight off. I think he was actually editing last week's show, so there should be a new episode live that he just finished. But yeah, it's a lot of work. That's why it's real interesting to see like more AI based tools coming out to kind of like chop it up for you and produce it. They're expensive, but I think at a certain level, they're probably worth it.
Yeah, for me, I have a hard time justifying it because I don't make money from the podcast. So it's definitely like the amount of time I put into it is like economically impactful to me. But since it's not like making me money, it's hard for me to like make that mental switch. Like, you still should pay for this though, like, because you'll have more time to do other things,
Yeah, 100%. Well, I'm definitely going to check out.
Control freak.
Yeah, that's why Rockwell does the editing, because he cares about it more than I do.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to check out B Dougie though on Twitch.
Yeah, it's a fun time. And also he's someone, like, because he's been around for a while, like, he has really good perspective on all the stuff that's happened and where things like have gone. Because he was talking about like GraphQL and serverless and all this stuff like in 2017, So it's like it's you can never really know like until like years after the fact, like whether that stuff was actually important or not. But then you can look back now and who made the right bets. Like, all right, well, I'm gonna see what bets they make next.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it'd be fun to go. How many videos? I guess VODs disappear, so he wouldn't have that many, but he has a few here I can watch.
He has a YouTube channel also.
Oh, cool.
Actually, because what he does, he streams and then he cuts them into like 5 to 20 minute long videos that he then uploads.
Right.
So he's like taking content creation as kind of like his main thing. So he does a lot more of that than coding these days. But that's because like it's a huge opportunity. He has a huge head start on it. He's like getting into TikTok also. He's like the first developer I know personally. I know a lot of people are talking about it, but he's one I actually know who's doing it.
Hey, buddy. I've seen like for whatever reason YouTube earlier today was like showing me videos of all these people, these content creators that have recently quit their jobs. These like dev related content creators that have just quit their jobs. Something like, some thumbnail where they're happy or whatever, and it says "I quit" on the thumbnail. I see you, Paul.
Later, Paul.
Yeah, I should probably take off sometime soon here too.
Yeah, it's all good. Fun times always.
I gotta walk Watson because he's not allowed in the yard unsupervised for a few days. Since
Did he do something naughty?
Well, he ate that
Yeah,
foxtail.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Thomas. I don't think I talked about it in Discord, but yeah, Watson ate a foxtail. It got stuck in his throat, and he had to take a trip to the vet, a day trip to the vet. He's fine now, but he's not allowed to be in the backyard until I fix one of my 3 weed whackers and then cut all the weeds down. I have 3 weed whackers that are all broke.
I think they made Thomas your name. Like, what's your Twitch handle?
It should just be Thomas Eckert, I think, right?
Got a couple different handles. Yeah, it is. Yeah, I know his Twitter is not that.
It's the one I'm communicating with right now. Are you sassing me, Thomas?
That's true. Yeah, you can just click his name. I do.
Not in StreamYard because it'll do this. Every time. I can't click on it. Cool. Yeah. Thanks again, man, for being on the show. And again, thanks again for just sticking around the community and dropping the knowledge. So definitely appreciate having you around.
Cool. Yeah, it's always fun discussions. So thank you.
And thanks everybody else for hanging out and chatting in the stream. So Sultan had a cool idea a few weeks ago about doing like after stream, the after show just happening in Discord, so everyone can like hang out and chat. I think that could be fun.
Yeah,
that could be a good time. But anyway, yeah, thanks everybody for hanging out and chatting, and we'll talk to you in Discord.
Yep. Bye, everybody.